Okay, if you're here just to hear this clock chiming, you can click on the timestamp in the description below. I am going to release a shorter version of this video that puts everything that I say now in a nutshell, because I have quite a lot to say about this clock and this video will be quite long. Alright, so today I would like to show you this Junghans Westminster chiming box clock. It's one of my best acquisitions from 2022 among the Vedette Atomat, this clock which is not working right now, the mini Junghans Vienna, the Ansonia clover shaped mantle clock, and this Junghans leather covered mantle clock. I would like to call it leather covered because it's easier to remember it that way. So yeah, I've also done some rearranging here. I moved some mantle clocks on the shelves, and the Chinese clocks are now down here. This clock was made in 1913 and it has the serial number A13. It was half of the normal retailing price, so I immediately bought it because I wanted to have one of these for a long time. And I'm glad I bought it because I like the style of it and I like how it sounds. It has a really nice design and I also like this reddish color. I initially thought that this was a removable crown, but it in fact isn't. It's fixed on the top of the case. And this was done in the factory because, as you might see, it has the same finish as the one on the case, and the iron hanger is fixed on this piece of wood. Now, before I'll get into detail, I'll let you hear it. Sorry for the blurry footage at the end. Because this clock was so cheap, I expected some damage to either the case or the movement. And I was right, there is some damage on the case. There's a chip in there. And if you go on this side, you might be able to see the veneer cracking. It has some cracks in there. There's a missing piece on this column thingy, you can see this part still has that one. And if you go down here on this small portion, the veneer was stripped off. It still had some remains when I got it, but those flaked off while I was trying to clean the case a little bit. It had some cobwebs on this bottom part. The dial was also damaged. Parts of the numerals were erased, so I repainted them with some acrylic paint, and I tried my best. I filled in this 1 right here, half of this 0, the whole 9, half of this 8, part of the 1 from the 12, and the bottom part of the 2. And I also filled in right here on this spandrel. I think it came out pretty nicely, and I tried not to cover the original paint. Before showing the movement, I would like to tell you what I think is the backstory of this clock, because I'm not 100% sure. As you might notice, the Junghans logo from the dial is missing, and it doesn't say made in Germany either, which is kind of odd. And if you look on the back plate of the movement, where the Junghans logo should have been, the material was cut and now there's a circle in there. You'll see that in a moment. However, they left their A13 serial number, so I was able to date this clock. And that confused me a little bit, so I did some research and I found out that when this clock was made, France and Germany didn't have a good relation. So maybe Junghans wanted to export their clocks to France, and because their name sounded German-like, they removed their logo from the dial and the movement, and the main made in Germany text. But they left their logo on the gong block, but not their name, it's only their logo. And also, if you go down here on this ring, instead of German Schlagwerk still, it says in French Carillon silence, which means chime silent, and this is the silencing mechanism. So I think that this clock was exported to France, and that's why it doesn't say Junghans anywhere on it. One last thing before showing the movement, I'll show you how the silencer works. This is an old style Westminster movement, so it doesn't have a self-correction mechanism, and you cannot push it backwards. So, to silence the chimes, you can see there's a string in there, and if I pull it, the hammers get lifted, and you would hang this on that wire in there. It doesn't work right now because the string is too long. I need to find one that's shorter. And the hammers would stay lifted, so when the chime barrel would roll, none of the hammers would get lifted and the chime wouldn't sound. So that's pretty much how it works. That was made like that so that the chimes wouldn't go out of sequence when the silencer is turned off. And also you might see the wavery glass. Glass was made by hand back then, and they didn't have machines to make it uniform, so it frequently had waves like this. Here's the back of the movement. Just as I told you, you can see that where the Junghans logo should have been, the material was cut and there's nothing left from that logo. And also below that cut you can see A13, and there's also a 100 in there. This pendulum rod is very odd because, as you might see, instead of simply putting this thing on the main rod, they fixed it with a pin at the end of it, which is kind of odd. I don't really know why they did that, but it's quite interesting. And if you go right here, this is the chiming part, and this is the singular striking hammer. Now, if you look in there, you can see the chime barrel and the hammers, and you might notice this wire that's wrapped around those blade springs that interact with the hammers and push them back to their place after they get lifted so that they would hit the chime rods more forcefully. Before that wire was there, when the silencer would be activated like this post right here would move to the right, and the blade springs wouldn't contact the hammers anymore, so the chime couldn't really be heard. And to correct that, I wrapped this wire that pushes the blade springs back at their place and neutralizes the force made by the silencer, and the post doesn't move anymore. So it's a quick repair, it's not a proper one. If I would properly repair this, I would take that post from there and rivet it back in, but I cannot really do that right now, so that's all that I could do back then. And yeah, that's how I fixed the chiming mechanism. You might also notice this lacquered steel plate behind the dial. That black substance is in fact lacquer. It's very common on those Westminster chiming clocks from the period. And you might see those arms coming from the front of the movement. Those are a safety feature. Let's say that you lay this clock on the floor and the movement is facing upwards because you don't have space to set it up. Those arms have some holes in them, and you would screw them in the case. I'll show you in a moment. You can see those are the screw holes. You screw them here on the side of the case. And in case the screws that hold this wooden bracket in the case fail, the movement wouldn't fall on the chime rods and break them, because this movement is extremely heavy and it could break the chime rods. So that's an interesting safety feature. Here's the gong block inside the case. And it says DRP in there, which means Deutsches Reich Patent. There are 2 patent numbers. One of them is probably for the chiming mechanism, and one of them is for a silent rack system, and that thing prevents the rack from making noise when it falls on the snail. And those are the screws that hold that wooden bracket in the case. You can see they are very skinny. Alright, so I discovered that, probably on accident, I deleted all the footage with the front of the movement of this clock that I had on my phone. And that's a bit unfortunate. I won't disassemble it right now because it takes a lot of time and it's getting late and I don't really feel like doing that. So I'll do that tomorrow, but I wanted to explain to you how the silent rack mechanism works. And this drawing represents a similar design to what's in the movement. It's not exactly how it is because the hour wheel and the intermediate wheel aren't linked this way, and this piece is not really visible. It's on the back of this wheel, so you won't see it. And here we have the rack, the hour wheel, the snail, and the intermediate wheel that goes between the hour wheel and the minute wheel. And the hour comes around and the rack falls on the snail. But Firstly, you can see it has this tail in there. So before falling on the snail, it falls on this piece right here. And it doesn't make a huge amount of noise as there is very little space between them. And as the clock runs, this wheel spins and this piece is lowered along with the tail. So the rack, instead of falling directly on the snail, it is gently lowered on it, which is probably another safety feature because, as you might see, they made this extension a little bit sharp. So if it falls directly on the snail, especially at 12 o'clock, it might damage it. And anyway, that's how this thing works. So I got the face off, and this is the front of the movement inside the Junghans Westminster chiming box clock. It looks rather interesting. It has a very complex series of levers and cams and everything. Those things right here near the mainsprings are the winding transmission mechanism, and they made it this way so that the holes for the winding key would line up. And because this is an old style Westminster movement, instead of having one lever that activates both sides, it has two separate levers for the chime side and for the strike side. You can see this is the lever that triggers the strike side, and this lever here, and this lever here triggers the chime side. The only linkage between the two trains is this lever right here, which prevents the striking train from activating while this lever from the chime side is lifted, so that the striking wouldn't trigger while the clock is chiming. And it also has a giant coiled spring wire on it. Might be able to see it in a moment. Yeah, there it is. And also down there is the solid pallet anchor escapement. It doesn't really want to focus. But yeah, that's a solid pallet anchor escapement. Now you're gonna see that silent rack mechanism in action. So I'm gonna trigger it. Alright, the rack fell, it's now loose. You can see it right here. And just there behind the intermediate wheel you can see there's a tiny piece of metal. Right there, that thing in there. That's the cam that operates this system. You might be able to see it better this way. Yeah, there it is. And here is the tail that interacts with that cam. And you can see that as the minute hand reaches the top of the hour, the rack is slowly being lowered. And now it's on the 12 o'clock step on the snail. And you might also notice that right here, this thingy in there, that thing is the pin that triggers the striking train by lifting this lever. You might just be able to see it in there. And also the striking activates slightly later than the chiming. Yeah, I didn't really capture that on camera, but if the clock runs by itself and I don't push the minute hand forward, the striking usually triggers a few seconds later than the chiming. And there's also something else that I forgot to mention in the videos that I filmed yesterday. This is the minute hand, and as you might see, the hole in the center is not a square, it's some sort of rectangular shape, and that was made intentionally because they wanted the minute hand to line up with the striking trigger pin, so you can only put it in one position. When I got the clock, that brass piece with the hole in it was not lined up with the minute hand, and the first quarter chime sequence was triggering at 10 minutes before the full hour. And I eventually got that corrected, so now it works just as intended. So the clock is now back together again, and this video is probably very long. I don't know how long it is, but yeah, I had quite a lot to say about it because I love this clock so much. And that's it for today. See you next time.